They built fortunes so powerful they bent cities to their will and turned private ambition into national destiny. Palaces rose, industries consolidated, and an entire country learned to mistake dominance for progress. But behind the myth, lies a story that was never meant to survive of labor erased, systems engineered, and power that learned how to disappear without losing control. This is not a story about forgotten wealth. It's about why forgetting was the final victory. They built fortunes so vast they reshaped skylines, dictated markets, and rewrote the meaning of power in America. Their names once opened every door. Their wealth flowed through railroads, steel mills, banks, and mansions that stretched beyond imagination. During the Gilded Age, these dynasties did not simply live in history. They engineered it. Yet today, many of them exist only in footnotes, their stories softened, fragmented, or quietly erased. What remains is a polished version of the era, stripped of the lives consumed to build it and the systems designed to preserve it. The Gilded Age was an age of spectacle. Wealth was not meant to be discreet. It was meant to be seen, measured, and feared. Palatial homes rose along coastlines and city avenues, each larger than the last, each intended to signal permanence. Inside, rooms were built not for comfort, but for scale, designed to host gatherings that blurred the line between social ritual and political theater. These spaces became unofficial centers of power, where decisions affecting millions were made. Over dinners and dances, far from factory floors and tenement streets. Behind the grandeur stood dynasties that mastered consolidation. They absorbed competitors, controlled supply chains, and shaped laws through influence rather than votes. Wealth moved vertically, passing down through generations, protected by trusts, estates, and legal frameworks designed to outlast scrutiny. Success was framed as inheritance rather than extraction, and dominance was recast as destiny. The public saw elegance in philanthropy, while the machinery of accumulation remained deliberately obscured. The labor that sustained these fortunes rarely entered the narrative. Millions worked long hours in dangerous conditions, producing the wealth that funded ballrooms and galleries. Strikes were broken, unions resisted, and dissent suppressed in the name of progress. When unrest erupted, it was framed as disorder rather than desperation. The dynasties positioned themselves as builders of America, while the cost of that construction was paid by people whose names history rarely records. As generations passed, the dynasties learned to adapt. Public attitudes shifted, and open displays of excess became liabilities. Wealth retreated from visibility, moving into institutions, investments, and influence that no longer required marble facades. Mansions were sold, repurposed, or demolished. Names faded from headlines, but the structures they built remained intact. Power did not disappear. It learned to operate quietly. Education played a role in this forgetting. Textbooks celebrated innovation and growth while glossing over concentration and inequality. The Gilded Age was framed as a necessary stage of development, its excesses treated as growing pains rather than deliberate choices. Dynasties became abstract forces rather than human actors, their responsibility diluted by time and narrative. Convenience, philanthropy further softened memory. Libraries, universities, and cultural institutions bore the names of benefactors, recasting wealth as generosity. These gifts shaped public perception, turning scrutiny into gratitude. The origins of the money became less important than its visible outcomes. In this way, dynasties managed their legacy as carefully as their assets, ensuring that remembrance focused on contribution rather than extraction. The homes they built tell a quieter story. Many stand empty or serve new purposes. They're original. Owners reduced to plaques or guided tours. Visitors admire craftsmanship without confronting intent. The scale impresses, but the silence obscures the systems that made such scale possible. These estates feel disconnected from the present, as if they belonged to a different world, when in reality they were foundations of the one that followed. Forgetting was not accidental. It was engineered through time, distance, and selective memory. As wealth became more abstract, its origins became easier to ignore. Dynasties benefited from this amnesia, their influence continuing through financial markets, political donations, and cultural norms without requiring recognition. The absence of their stories made their power seem natural rather than constructed. Yet traces remain in patterns that persist. Inequality mirrors old divisions. Opportunity still clusters around inherited advantage. Institutions reflect priorities set generations ago. The Gilded Age did not end. It evolved. Its dynasties may no longer host lavish balls or dominate headlines, but their imprint is embedded in systems that shape everyday life. To remember these dynasties fully is uncomfortable. It requires acknowledging that modern prosperity was built alongside exploitation, that elegance and hardship coexisted by design. It challenges the idea that wealth naturally trickles down, or that history inevitably corrects imbalance. Forgetting offers comfort, but remembrance offers clarity. The stories left untold are not relics of a distant past. They explain how power learned to disguise itself, how inequality became normalized, and how legacy can survive without visibility. The Gilded Age dynasties America chose to forget were not erased by time alone, but by a collective willingness to look away from the origins of influence that still shape the present. At the height of the Gilded Age, power demanded visibility. Wealth was not considered real unless it could be seen, measured, and felt by others. Dynasties announced their arrival through scale, excess, and spectacle, using architecture, industry, and social rituals as instruments of dominance. Mansions were built not merely as homes, but as statements, positioned on hills, coastlines, and city avenues where they could not be ignored. Their size alone communicated authority, asserting that money had the right to reshape land, labor, and legacy. Visibility was the currency of legitimacy, and those who possessed it controlled the narrative of success. Industry followed the same logic. Railroads, factories, and financial institutions expanded aggressively, absorbing competitors and consolidating control. These dynasties did not operate quietly. Their names appeared on buildings, newspapers, and charitable foundations. Public presence reinforced private power. The more visible the wealth, the more inevitable it seemed, as if dominance were a natural outcome rather than a constructed one. Society learned to associate scale with competence, abundance with merit, and permanence with entitlement. Social life became an extension of this display. Invitations to exclusive gatherings functioned as signals of access and alignment. Ballrooms doubled as negotiation spaces, where political fervors and economic decisions blended seamlessly with entertainment. These events were reported, photographed, and discussed, further amplifying the visibility of elite power. The public saw elegance and order, rarely questioning the mechanisms that funded such refinement. Yet visibility carried risk. As wealth concentrated and living conditions for workers deteriorated, resentment grew. Strikes, protests, and investigative journalism exposed the gap between opulence and hardship. The same visibility that once protected dynasties now attracted scrutiny. Excess began to look unstable. Public admiration slowly shifted toward skepticism, and the dynasties recognized that remaining in plain sight no longer guaranteed security. This is where transformation began. Power did not retreat, it reorganized. The dynasties learned that influence could survive without spectacle, and that invisibility offered protection visibility never could. Wealth moved away from overt displays and into structures that required no public recognition. Trusts, holding companies, and endowments replaced personal ownership. Control became abstract, shielded by legal frameworks that dispersed responsibility while preserving authority. Architecture reflected this shift. Grand estates were sold, subdivided, or quietly demolished. Public-facing symbols of dominance faded, replaced by assets that blended into financial systems rather than standing apart from them. Where once a mansion declared presence, now a portfolio ensured influence without exposure. Power no longer needed to impress, it needed to endure. Education and culture adapted accordingly. Textbooks simplified narratives. The dynasty's most controversial practices were softened into innovation stories, their excess reframed as ambition. Visibility was selectively preserved only where it served legitimacy, such as philanthropy. Donations to universities, museums, and hospitals ensured that names remained associated with generosity rather than accumulation. This controlled visibility maintained influence while avoiding direct scrutiny. The retreat from spectacle also altered public perception of wealth itself. Without obvious monuments to excess, inequality became harder to visualize. Power felt diffuse, impersonal, and inevitable. When wealth operates quietly, it appears less threatening, even when its impact is greater. Dynasties benefited from this ambiguity as their influence persisted without demanding attention or provoking resistance. Political engagement followed the same pattern. Rather than public endorsements or visible alliances, influence flowed through donations, lobbying, and policy shaping conducted behind closed doors. Power learned to operate through systems rather than individuals. Decisions affecting millions were made without ceremonial display, insulated from the kind of outrage that visible excess once generated. Over time, this invisibility became self-reinforcing. As generations passed, fewer people remembered the origins of dynastic wealth. Names faded from public consciousness even as their capital continued to circulate. Without visible symbols to challenge, inequality appeared abstract, disconnected from human agency. Power without faces is harder to confront, harder to assign responsibility to, and easier to accept as structural rather than chosen. The most effective aspect of this transformation was its subtlety. There was no dramatic withdrawal, no announcement of change. Visibility simply diminished as necessity dictated. Mansions emptied, headlines shifted. Wealth continued to grow, now embedded within markets and institutions that felt neutral rather than controlled. The dynasties had learned that silence could protect influence more effectively than grandeur. This shift also altered how success was defined. Achievement became less about display and more about access. Power operated through networks rather than landmarks. Those inside the system recognized its continuity, while those outside saw only fragments. The disappearance of visible dominance did not weaken authority, it strengthened it by reducing resistance. In this way, the Gilded Age dynasties mastered a critical lesson. Visibility is useful for establishing power, but invisibility is essential for preserving it. They transitioned from builders of monuments to architects of systems, ensuring that their influence could survive public backlash, economic shifts, and changing moral standards. The era of spectacle ended, but the era of control quietly continued, woven into structures that no longer required recognition to function, while visibility defined the rise of the Gilded Age dynasties. Control defined their daily operation. Power was exercised not through constant public action, but through the quiet shaping of systems that governed work, money, and movement. These families understood early that ownership alone was insufficient. True dominance required influence over rules, norms, and expectations, ensuring that wealth reproduced itself with minimal resistance. Control was embedded into contracts, laws, and institutions long before it was ever questioned. Labor sat at the center of this system. Industrial expansion demanded a workforce that was abundant, compliant, and replaceable. Wages were calculated to sustain survival, not security. Long hours were normalized as discipline, exhaustion reframed as character building. Workers were not expected to rise within the system, only to sustain it. When unrest appeared, it was treated as a malfunction rather than a message. Strikes were met with force, legal pressure, or strategic concessions designed to restore productivity without redistributing power. Control extended beyond factories into housing, education, and credit. Company towns blurred the line between employment and existence. Rent, food, and wages circulated within the same controlled economy, ensuring dependency. Education for working-class families emphasized obedience and basic skills rather than critical thinking or advancement. Opportunity was presented as theoretical rather than attainable, reinforcing the idea that position was earned rather than assigned. Financial systems reinforced this hierarchy. Banks aligned closely with industrial power, extending credit to expansion while restricting access to those without collateral. Debt became a tool of discipline, binding individuals and smaller businesses into long-term dependence. Wealth moved freely at the top while remaining tightly constrained below. This imbalance was not accidental. It was designed to stabilize accumulation by limiting disruption from below. Law served as both shield and weapon. Contracts favored those who drafted them. Courts moved quickly when property was threatened and slowly when lives were damaged. Legal language obscured responsibility, dispersing accountability across entities designed to absorb blame without consequence. The system did not need to be overtly unjust to be effective. It only needed to be consistent in whose interests it protected. Social norms reinforced this control. Success was framed as moral achievement, while poverty was cast as failure. This narrative discouraged solidarity by turning inequality into a personal verdict rather than a structural condition. Those who struggled were taught to blame themselves, while those who succeeded were praised regardless of the system that enabled them. Control became psychological as much as economic. Media played a subtle role in maintaining this balance. Newspapers, dependent on advertising revenues, softened criticism of powerful interests. Innovation and expansion were celebrated, while labor conditions were minimized or reframed as necessary sacrifice. When dissent became impossible to ignore, it was portrayed as chaos rather than response. Public attention was directed toward growth and spectacle, away from systemic critique. Within elite circles, control was maintained through coordination rather than competition. Dynasties intermarried, invested together, and shared influence across industries. Rivalry existed, but it rarely threatened the system itself. Disputes were resolved privately, preserving collective dominance. Power functioned as a network, resilient because it was distributed yet aligned. This environment limited upward mobility without appearing to forbid it. Exceptional stories were amplified to reinforce belief in the system. Rare successes were treated as proof that anyone could rise, masking how uncommon such outcomes were. Hope functioned as a stabilizing force, reducing pressure for structural change by promising individual escape. Over time, control became less visible but more efficient. As public backlash against excess grew, overt domination gave way to procedural authority. Regulations were shaped quietly. Policies favored capital accumulation without naming beneficiaries. Influence moved from personal decree to institutional momentum. Decisions appeared neutral, technical, inevitable. What made this control durable was its adaptability. When challenged, it adjusted without surrendering core advantage. Reforms were introduced selectively, easing pressure while preserving hierarchy. Labor protections improved just enough to prevent collapse. Wages rose incrementally without closing gaps. Each concession reinforced the idea that the system was responsive, even as its foundations remained unchanged. This approach ensured continuity across generations. Heirs inherited not just wealth, but systems optimized for its preservation. They did not need to assert dominance publicly. The structure did that for them. Influence persisted through inertia. Embedded in processes few people questioned because they appeared ordinary. The dynasty's greatest achievement was not accumulation, but normalization. Inequality ceased to feel temporary or unjust and instead became expected. Control operated most effectively when it no longer needed enforcement, when people adjusted their expectations to fit the system rather than challenging it. Power became invisible not because it vanished, but because it blended into the background of everyday life. Forgetting was not an accident of time. It was a process shaped deliberately by what was preserved and what was allowed to disappear. As the Gilded Age faded into the past, the dynasties that had once dominated headlines learned that survival no longer depended on visibility, but on selective memory. Power did not need to be celebrated to endure. It only needed to avoid being questioned. Erasure became as valuable as expansion. Physical symbols were the first to change. Mansions that once defined skylines were sold, repurposed, or quietly demolished. Estates were divided into parcels, their origins blurred by development. Without the scale of stone and iron to provoke comparison, inequality lost one of its most obvious reference points. The absence of monuments softened the past, making it easier to imagine that excess had been exaggerated or exceptional rather than systemic. What replaced these symbols was a carefully curated version of history. Certain figures were remembered as innovators, philanthropists, or patrons of culture, while the structures that enabled their dominance faded into abstraction. Museums displayed art without context. Universities honored donors without interrogating sources of wealth. Memory was framed around contribution rather than consequence, transforming accumulation into generosity. Education played a critical role in this narrowing of narrative. Textbooks summarize the Gilded Age as a period of growth and transition, emphasizing progress while compressing exploitation into brief mentions. Labor struggles were reduced to episodes rather than outcomes of sustained imbalance. Dynastic influence was described as entrepreneurship rather than consolidation. By simplifying complexity, history became manageable and non-threatening. Language further aided this forgetting. Terms like industrialist and magnate carried neutrality, even admiration, while words that implied harm were avoided. Inequality became disparity, control became leadership, and extraction became development. This shift did not change what had happened, but it changed how it was understood. Vocabulary distanced actions from effects, allowing reflection without discomfort. Cultural nostalgia reinforced this process. Images of grand balls, elegant attire, and architectural beauty circulated widely, detached from the labor and conditions that sustained them. The Gilded Age was romanticized as an era of style rather than scrutinized as an era of imbalance. Nostalgia turned power into aesthetic, making critique feel like cynicism rather than responsibility. Philanthropy helped stabilize this selective memory. Foundations and charitable institutions funded by dynastic wealth shaped research, art, and public discourse. While providing real benefits, they also influenced which questions were asked and which were left untouched. Structural critique rarely came from institutions dependent on elite support. Silence did not need to be enforced. It was incentivized. As generations passed, distance did the rest. Without living witnesses, stories lost urgency. Exploitation without faces became easier to dismiss. The complexity of systems faded faster than the simplicity of myths. The idea that such dynasties could no longer exist gained traction, even as their influence persisted through modern equivalents less tied to names and more to networks. This forgetting was reinforced by transformation rather than disappearance. Dynastic power adapted to new forms that felt contemporary and merit-based. Corporate structures replaced family names. Financial instruments replaced land. Influence became global, mobile, and less personal. Without a clear antagonist, critique struggled to find focus. The past seemed irrelevant to systems that presented themselves as new. Public discourse shifted accordingly. Inequality was discussed as a modern challenge disconnected from historical roots. Solutions focused on innovation rather than redistribution, efficiency rather than accountability. By severing the present from the past, responsibility became diffuse. No one was to blame because the system appeared to have emerged naturally. Media accelerated this amnesia. Stories favored immediacy over continuity. Scandals were framed as isolated failures rather than expressions of long-standing dynamics. Attention moved quickly, preventing sustained examination. What could not be condensed into a headline struggled to survive in public consciousness. Even when reminders surfaced, they were often neutralized by framing. Historical investigations emphasized drama over structure, focusing on personalities rather than systems. This personalization made failure seem individual rather than collective. The dynasties became characters in stories rather than architects of enduring arrangements. Forgetting also offered comfort. Remembering fully would require confronting how deeply modern prosperity is connected to historical imbalance. It would complicate narratives of fairness and opportunity. It would demand questions about inheritance, legitimacy, and repair. Forgetting allowed continuity without reckoning. Yet traces remained beneath the surface. Economic patterns echoed old hierarchies. Access clustered predictably. Opportunity correlated with lineage more than rhetoric admitted. The absence of memory did not erase impact. It obscured origin. Power continued to reproduce itself, benefiting from a past no longer actively recalled. What was lost in this process was not just history, but clarity. Without understanding how dynasties shaped systems, it became harder to recognize similar dynamics in new forms. Forgetting did not neutralize power. It refined it. By shedding its most visible markers, influence became more adaptable and less accountable. In this way, being forgotten was not a failure for these dynasties, but an evolution. Their names faded, their structures endured, and their greatest achievement was not lasting recognition, but lasting normalcy. A world shaped so thoroughly by their influence that it no longer felt imposed, only inevitable. When the Gilded Age dynasties faded from public memory, it was not because their power vanished, but because it learned to move without leaving fingerprints. Their estates disappeared, their names softened, and their stories were reframed, yet the systems they shaped continued forward, refined and unquestioned. What once required stone, spectacle, and visibility now operates through institutions, capital, and inherited advantage, far harder to confront because it no longer announces itself. Forgetting became the final stage of dominance, allowing influence to survive without scrutiny and inequality to persist without a clear origin. The true legacy of these dynasties is not what history chose to remember, but what it was encouraged to overlook, reminding us that when power succeeds in erasing its past, it gains control over the future itself.